great pleasure to be able to introduce our luncheon speaker today. Those of us who get choked up when we talk about journalism that matters, the journalism that moves hearts and minds and moves us toward a better understanding of the human condition and the world in which we live, have in mind the kind of work that our speaker today has been pursuing and producing throughout her career. I'm speaking of a journalism that is deeply reported, textured, intelligent, empathic, and engaged in the lives of people. Sometimes people who are poor, sometimes people who are in crisis, sometimes people, regular people, who find themselves in the crosshairs of history. This is the kind of work that Isabel Wilkerson has been giving her readers for a very long time. Let me begin with one iconic example many of you may be familiar with. Here's the story of Nicholas, age 10, a boy growing up on the south side of Chicago. Nicholas, a fourth grader, was a gentle, brooding boy who, through circumstances of his life and a complicated family, which included a mother on welfare working toward a college degree and an absent father who had a drug problem, had to assume the responsibilities of an adult. I'd like to read briefly from that story if I could. It's an astonishing piece of work. Of all of the men in his family's life, Nicholas is perhaps the most dutiful. When the television picture goes out again, when the 3-year-old scratches the 4-year-old, when their mother, Angela, needs ground beef from the store, or the bathroom clean, can't find her switch to whip him, or the other children, it is Nicholas's name that rings out to fix whatever is wrong. He is nanny, referee, housekeeper, handyman. Some nights he is up past midnight, mopping the floors, putting the children to bed, and washing their school clothes in the bathtub. It is a nightly chore. The children have few clothes and wear the same thing every day. Nicholas was a boy squirming in line, shoes untied, wanting to be a fireman, but, as Isabel wrote, but his walk is the stiff slog of a worried father behind on the rent. It was an astonishing piece of work back in 1993, and it won her the Pulitzer Prize in 1994. In 2005, Isabel returned to Chicago to tell the story of Nicholas's mother, Angela Whitaker, who had overcome astonishing odds to get a nursing degree. It was another extraordinary piece of work that blurred the lines between journalism and literature. Isabel Wilkerson was born in Washington. Her father, a Tuskegee Airman, was from Virginia. Her mother was from Rome, Georgia. They met at Howard University. Isabel, also a graduate of Howard, where she edited the student newspaper, went on to internships at the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, and then to a job at the Detroit Free Press, where her unusual talent was spotted by Anne Quinlan at the New York Times. And then Isabel moved to the New York Times. She was the Times Chicago bureau chief. She's one of the profession's most important writing awards, and there are many, including the Pulitzer Prize for her work about Nicholas and also the stories of the Midwestern floods. And she was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. Isabel is a believer in the power of newspapers and the written word, and very much a believer in the power of storytelling. Here's what she said to an interviewer at Emory University. Profile. In the end, nothing really matters until I can see from the perspective of the human heart. And this, in a world of deadlines, it's important to recognize that every story is a miracle. The work that Isabel is now engaged in is a sweeping history of African-American migration from south to north in the 20th century. She tells this complicated and layered story through the lives of 3 individuals, 3 families. It's been an enormous undertaking, and for any other mortal, the work of a lifetime. As she again told the interviewer at Emory University, where she's the James Cox Professor of Journalism, she screened more than 1,500 candidates to find her 3 interview subjects. Then she spent the better part of 8 years gaining the trust of these elderly respondents, listening to their stories of uprooting and resettlement, retracing journeys out of the South, and conducting research on their lives and the lives of others like them in 6 states across the country. As she said, her subjects faced a heartbreaking choice: living in the South at that time. They could stay in their homes where Jim Crow laws remained in effect, or they could leave the only places they had ever known, pull up stakes, and move themselves and their families to new cities, usually sight unseen. Those who chose to migrate often did so because they could not tolerate a life without dignity. Dignity is a word that rings throughout Isabel Wilkerson's work. Likewise, a very deep sense of empathy. These are the characteristics that engage the talent and imagination of our guests today. Please welcome Isabel Wilkerson.
Such a pleasure and honor to be here. This is such a beautiful room. I feel like I'm inside a wedding cake. I am not going to be talking about the economics of journalism and whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I think that the morning's panel explored that with great precision and breadth, and so I'm not going to talk about that. I frankly am just coming out of the cave of writing a book. So I am, emerging to the clear lights of reality, and still making the adjustment to that. I'm going to be talking essentially about what I learned on my way to writing a book, and how I came to the topic that I chose, which, had I known when I began it all that would entail, I don't know if I'd be standing here right now. I think actually that for a lot of us who begin narrative nonfiction, if someone told you that you were going to take a trip and get a flat tire in St. Louis, run out of gas in New Mexico, and get totally turned around in the Mojave Desert, you might not even try it. So it's a good thing we don't know a lot of these things ahead of time, because probably a lot of narrative nonfiction would never get written. But one of the things that came up earlier today was, how do you find the subject when you are a reporter, primarily most of us being newspaper reporters, and you're covering things for many, many years? There's often the temptation to take one of those stories and to turn that into a book, and many, many people are able to do that quite successfully, beautifully, such as Ron Suskind. There's a natural segue from one to the other. The story that I often get connected to the most, and I often joke to Angela on the times that I talk with her, that I said, we'll both be with our canes in the rocking chair at the assisted living place. Someone will be asking us, remember that story that ran way back in the 1990s in that other century, and what you did? I sort of feel like that'll always be there with me. But when I wrote that story, I felt that I had done all that I could with that particular story, and there were people who thought that that could have been a book. But I felt as if I had done what I needed to do with that, that was self-contained. I decided that it occurred to me that I had been spending many, many years in Chicago and other cities writing about the misery of the cities on so many levels: drugs, crime, family dysfunction, and basically from Chicago, I've been writing from ground zero of those kinds of things. And in the Chicago Bureau, we had Detroit, we had Chicago, we had Minneapolis, we had St. Louis, and we had a lot of the major Rust Belt cities, which became, again, ground zero for all kinds of economic disease, which ended up, unease, which ended up hurting so many families and people. And so I felt that I wanted to go beyond the kind of the mind-numbing daily recitation of misery, and to do something that was transcendent and went beyond that. I also noticed that in the course of reporting on many of the stories that I was doing in the Midwest, I was often finding that there would always be some paragraph, a line in the story that I wasn't even seeking, but just sort of as background, that would say this mother or grandmother came from Arkansas to Chicago in 1942, or this person came from Mississippi to south side of Chicago in 1937, or this individual came from South Carolina to Washington, D.C. in whatever time. And I began to realize that that was that the those little throwaway lines actually were telling a much larger story that merited a great deal more attention than I think any of the newspaper stories that we obviously are working on could possibly treat. I also began to realize that because I was a national correspondent, I was reporting from so many different places in the country, that this was a theme that was running wherever I happened to be. When I was in LA, I was running into the same thing. People in LA were saying that they had come from Louisiana. So there was this theme that I began to become aware of slowly through the course of my reporting. And then I began to think back to my own life, and I realized that my own parents had been part of this thing. Then I decided that the families obviously were going to, by definition, be going to those 3 different cities in the north and the west. But they also were going to be leaving at different decades. I wanted to make it difficult for myself. However complicated I could make it. And that is because of this commitment to show the breadth and width of this epic migration. It did not happen in a couple of years. A lot of people ask me, what were the years of it? And people seem to resist the demographic reality that it began in 1915, 1916, the earliest references to it. And of course, there were people who left before, but the massive, overwhelming, outpouring of people did not begin until the middle of World War I. And that was because while many people in the South wanted to leave before then, there was no assurance of anything that they could do to make a living until there were opportunities that came during wartime. Those opportunities came because there was a cutoff in immigration clearly from Europe during World War I, because it was a European war. In fact, it was referred to as the European War, but it was called we call it World War II. They called it the European War in 1917. And so many of the immigrants, recently arrived immigrants, were moving back back home in order to check on their families or to fight for in their homelands. And immigration came to a halt at the very time that the country needed more workers to build up for the war effort. Where were they going to turn? In today's world, we turn to the developing world, what we call emerging markets. Well, at that time, the emerging market in this country for the United States was the South. And so that's where the industrialists went. And they sent labor agents and such. But anyway, the world began to open up to African Americans who were in the South. And that's what began the migration. The migration began, there was a large number of people. There were over 500,000 who left during World War I. And then sociologists and others declared it over and said that this is done because the war is over and surely there would be no need for people to come. But once the door had been opened, and once people had uncles and aunts and cousins and people here, and the conditions had not changed in the South, things were just as bad as they had been before. Whether you're talking about lynchings or the reality of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a whole other thing. We talk about Jim Crow, but I have examples of what that meant. I'll give you one example. One example of Jim Crow is that there were actually black and white elevators in the city of Atlanta, for example. We think of water fountains and all that, but those are just the more commonly known things. There was Jim Crow as to the way people drove. A black person did not pass a white person driving on the road. Ray Baker Stanner, who was one of the premier journalists at the turn of the century, wrote a book called Following the Color Line, in which he went to Atlanta after the 1906 riots and wanted to sort of get a sense, he was from New York, wanted to get a sense of what was life like in the South at that time. And he documented a lot of what he found to be just astounding specificity of what we call Jim Crow now. And so he came back describing that. The bars actually were segregated. There would be a bar, but there was an end where the black people sat, and then there was another end of the bar where the white people sat. And then at a certain point, that was getting too complicated, so then they decided to just have black bars and then white bars. One other example is that in Oklahoma, there were black telephone booths and white telephone booths. Also reported in North Carolina. There are so many examples. I don't want to tell them all to you because I want you to read the book. Those are just some of them. In any case, the migration was deemed to have been over after World War I. But what we now know with the benefit of time, it was only just beginning. The numbers would increase. Even during the Depression, they would continue. And only increase during World War II, when about 1.5 million people left the South. And then they would continue to increase in the 1950s and on into the 1960s. So the question would be, what do you say are the years of the Great Migration if people continue to come until the 1970s? So so basically with the benefit of time, my time frame is World War I until 1970. Now, when you're starting a book, there are all these wonderful people who have all kinds of comments to tell you about what you should do and how you should approach it. And someone said, well, you know, you're saying World War I, you'll never find, I mean, World War I mean, you're not, you're saying you're doing, it's journalism, it's nonfiction, you're not going to find anyone from World War I. Do you know how old that person would have to be? Yeah, because the one I found was real old. He was born in 1896. I began the reporting, the research for these people around in the mid-90s. I found him and interviewed him. He actually was a veteran from World War I. One of my criteria was that it could not be a child. I have all these criteria, but it couldn't be a child of the migration. In other words, I didn't want someone who was 3 at the time of the migration. I needed someone who was an adult who made the decision to migrate, because otherwise you don't understand why this is going on. You don't understand how the decision was made. They could say, well, Mom told me this, this, and this, but I want to hear from Mom. And so I needed someone who was of a particular age during World War I, and I actually found him. I actually was determined to find him because I had been told I wouldn't. And I actually even found a birthday card for him, believe it or not, when he turned 100. Can you believe that there actually are birthday cards for that? He was amazed. That was one of them. That was a sweet one. So those were some of the criteria that I was looking at, considering as I went about looking for people. Some of the others were, I wanted to be able to find people who were, who had a good story from beginning to end. I interviewed over 1,500 people in order to do this. There was a tremendous amount of travel going from New York, spending time in New York. I went to quilting clubs in Brooklyn. I went to AARP meetings on the south side of Chicago. I went to Juneteenth celebrations in Los Angeles. If anyone doesn't know what Juneteenth is, I can tell you about that if you have a question about that. I went to numerous, believe it or not, state clubs that exist to this day in many of these northern cities. Meaning there is a state club, there are several Mississippi clubs. They're competing multiple Mississippi clubs in Chicago. I mean, they're from Greenwood, Mississippi, Greenville, Mississippi, Grenada, Mississippi, all these, Brookhaven, Mississippi. I mean, places that I've never even heard of. They all have state clubs. They meet. They have picnics. They talk about what their kids are not doing right. They meet and they keep touch, and they talk about people who are back home doing this and doing that, so they stay in touch. There are numerous Louisiana clubs in Los Angeles. Many, many, many from Alexandria, from Lake Charles, Louisiana, from Monroe, Louisiana, from, of course, New Orleans, multiple competing New Orleans clubs. And they all meet Mardi Gras, etc. There are all kinds of St. Joseph's Day, any reason to get together and celebrate, they do, as the Louisiana way. And also in New York, there are clubs in Brooklyn that are Carolina clubs. So those were other places that I would go to find people. Really, these are people who are very connected and would have stories to tell. That process took about 18 months because it takes time just to get to those places and to talk with people. Again, I was looking for people who had a great story about life in the South, a strong story about life in the South, how and why they got out, and what happened to them in the North. I also needed a good storyteller, because it doesn't matter if you have a good story if you can't tell it. I mean, it's like, it's like, you can make life harder or difficult. I mean, I make life hard enough for myself anyway, but that's one thing that I wanted to at least not have to worry about. I needed someone who could communicate their story. It's interesting, you had people who were great storytellers, But the dullest of stories, I mean, really, this was not going. There was no harm, there was no fraud. It just they were talking. And then there were people who had great stories, but it was just, you know, not coming out. And they're also, my view is I look at this holistically, and I think there's a reason for all of this. People, you come organically to the people you're supposed to have. I just really believe that. Then I needed someone who would show a willingness to participate, because without access, you have nothing. You could have a great story, great storyteller, but if they're not letting you in the house, then you know you still don't have a story. Then I needed something that we often don't think about. This was a very long-term process, partly because I'm one person and I'm having to interview all these people. I can't be at one place at the same time. That's the reason why this thing took so long. I can't be in LA and New York and Chicago at the same time. I have to make plans to and organize, a lot of organizing that I had to be done in order to do this. So I needed to have someone who could be in it for the long haul, not only give me access in the beginning, but with whom I would have chemistry. Meaning, ultimately, we often don't think about this, but they have to like you, you have to like them. They don't have to love you, and you don't have to love them, but they have to like not be like nauseated at the thought of the ride. So there needed to be some chemistry and commitment that I could perceive from them. So that because I realize, I mean, from the work that I kind of do, I don't write about, you know, famous people who sort of have to talk to you because they have, you know, a new movie coming out. I mean, I have interviewed people like that, and they're often the most difficult, unpleasant interviews. But I talk to people who otherwise don't have to talk to anyone, and they could pull out at any time. And I have a great respect for that. I have a great respect for their privacy and their you know, self-efficacy or whatever social scientists call it. So I also needed people for the narrative itself. I needed people who had complementary stories. You didn't need all the stories to be the same, because the narrative is extremely complex. The narrative follows them from beginning to end, and it is not, this is the story of one person beginning to end, move on to the next person. It's interweaving their stories throughout the narrative. You see them at the same, the three people are seen at pretty much the same part of their lives. You're introduced to them that way, and you revisit them in a rolling sequence in a narrative that's all leading to this arc. So it's extremely complicated, very complex structure that I have here. So the stories needed to be complementary, not the same. Working together, but not the same. They needed to have different life trajectories. They also needed to be of different classes, different socioeconomic status, which would be more representative of the many different kinds of people who left the South for the North. They also needed to have different outcomes, but finally they needed to be distinct personalities and characters. You know, narrative nonfiction. At the end of the day, you know, now we're saying it's the economy silly or whatever. It's the characters. We have nothing without the characters. The characters had to be sort of self-sustaining people that someone would want to read about. They had to be kind of sometimes a little quirky but normal at the same time. That's hard. That's a hard line to find. But they had to be just fascinating personalities in and of themselves. So those were basically the large things I was looking for as I set out to try to find them. I've also told you where I went to find them. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the challenges that came. I think we all journalists can relate to this. First of all, there were skeptics at every turn, starting with the very first meeting of some of the people. Now I went into senior centers in order to find some of the characters. That was one of the main. That was like that's a treasure trove, because you're going in. You're in LA. Nothing but people over 65. That's your cohort. You know, that's your demographic. You know, hundreds of people there. They're all, you know, obviously fit enough and well enough to be there, and they're talkative, and they have little friends among themselves. And so, and they are, you know, active, and so that's what you need. So I go in there and I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, one of my character could be in this room. So I go in and I get on the schedule. This all requires quite a bit of arranging ahead of time. And I happen to be on the schedule, but there's a person on the schedule before me. And the person on the schedule before me is someone from the LA County Department of Aging. And the person gets up and he says, I'm here to, you know, I have this passing out these these brochures to you, to the seniors, to alert you to the dangers of strangers coming to your desk. We're getting reports of contractors and other people who will pose as all kinds of people to get information from you. And they will use this information to get access to your bank account, access to your home. People are losing their homes by giving too much information, so you need to be very careful about who you give information to. Here's the brochure. I want you to read it very carefully, make note. And then, then next on the schedule is this woman who's working on this book about the migration, and she wants to talk with you basically about your entire life story. So that was like day one at that center, senior center. And oddly enough, the people ended up talking to me, partly because so much of this has to do with the personal connection. I remember so many times being in Chicago and interviewing people, because my stock and trade is sort of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. I would talk with them for hours and hours and hours. And they knew I was, I tell them originally I'm with the New York Times, and they're telling me their life story. And then at the end of it, I'm, closing up, and of course, when you close up your notebook, then they have more to say, and we all know the drill with that. But then the last thing they would say is, and so what station is this going to be on? So, they talked to me this whole time, connected with me, they bare their soul to me, and had no clue as to even where this is going. So at the end of the day, I'm convinced that it really does matter, the personal connection matters more than anything. And so you make this personal connection, so I was able to overcome that particular challenge. Another challenge was of skeptical, wary, outright, and just truly threatened wives of some of the seniors. You would be amazed. Yes, I know.
You are very attractive.
Oh, thank you, Joe Biden. I literally had so much trouble. I didn't realize that. I went in not expecting that. I just thought, I'm here, to stand at basically at that time people were my grandfather's knee, and that's not how the wife was viewing it. And so I would call, and she'd say, "He's not interested in talking with you," or "He's not here. He's not here." You could hear him saying, "Who is that?" It's not an accident that the 3 people I ended up with were all widowed. All widowed. Then there were other problems. There were, skeptical children. The kids were in their 70s, many of them. And so some of them were weary because I might have made the connections with mom or dad. And you can imagine, any of us can imagine, if someone's talking to your mother or father, you kind of want to know, now, who is this person? And so I had to win them over after already having made the connection. Then the other thing I didn't anticipate was people who were writing their own books. 80-year-olds who said they were writing their own books. And in LA, particularly, only in LA, writing their screenplay. You would not believe. I actually got to the point, where I expected it. I want to say, and if you're not writing your own screenplay, I would like to talk. One woman who I like best of all, I think, she was quite. She said, "It's really good what you're doing, and I really appreciate it." But someone else actually has gotten to me first, and another author's gotten to me, and she's going to be writing the book of my life story, and about my migration. I said, "Oh, that's wonderful," because I feel very generous about this. To think there are 7 million people or more who participated in this. No one person could possibly reach all those people. I mean, so many people could, after I'm done, so many other people could start again and try to do something else, because it's just huge, it's just that big. So I don't take it personally, and I just, "Oh, that's wonderful that you have someone else doing a book about you." Well, what is it about, and who is it? She said, "Oh, it's my granddaughter who's in the 6th grade." So, yes, my 6th grade granddaughter, she's going to be writing my book, so I'm not going to be able to talk to you. So that was one missed opportunity. I haven't seen the book yet, but I think that I'm sure it's coming. And finally, three other things that were true challenges. One was illness, which is an occupational hazard when you are building your project around people of this age group. The age group was, basically mid-70s to 100, as I told you. And illness was part of what would happen. I would fly out to LA or something and find the person's in the hospital, or I can't talk with them as easily. Maybe that they'd say their daughter, because remember the kids were in the 70s, the daughter or son might be in the hospital, and they couldn't bear to talk with me at that point. So, just when you're in town again, and it's like they have no idea, I don't just come in town just to be coming in town. I'm here specifically. It's like I'm adding up the cost of this, and now I'm not able to talk with you. So there were experiences like that. And then the ultimate, which was death. All three of the main characters died. All three in the course of the reporting. And that turned what was journalism into history overnight, which is one of the reasons that I went south to Emory to be able to get access to archives to fill in for some of the things that I needed to do it anyway, and I'm very glad that I made the choice. What I did was I decided to talk to the people first, knowing that the people would not be around forever, but the archives would always be there. And so that has turned out to be the way that I needed to do it. And so I've had access to all kinds of books I would not normally have had. And then finally, the toughest challenge was my mother. My mother did not want to submit to an interview. Did not want to, no, just not, because she just could. I mean, she just didn't want to talk. And it was interesting, most people would think that she would. My mother's a character in herself. And so over time, she would listen, and I would say, I'm not going to press her on it, not going to press her. It's not like she had anything to hide, she just didn't want to be in it, or she didn't see the need to it. It's just like whenever you're covering something and you have one person that you have to talk to, you're stuck with that. See, I had the universe open to me for the others, but I only have one mother, so if I want to get a story from her, I got to deal with her. And so I had to, play along with it. So what was happening was I was getting all these interesting stories and comments from people that I was talking to. And she started to, say, well, that happened to me, or that didn't happen to me. That's not how it was at all. I don't remember that happening. Or, well, in Georgia, it wasn't like that. So then I'd start getting it slowly before you knew it. I was getting stuff, and I was taking notes, and, I had, like, a lot after all of this. Some of the amazing stories that I hadn't even heard in my entire life growing up. Because she didn't really talk about the South that much, which is also a common thing. A lot of them don't talk about it. And I think for many people who have immigrant ancestors, who they might have known, great-grandparents, you might find some people did a lot of talking, some people didn't talk at all. And I think that's to be respected and almost to be expected. But that was a surprise for me with this process. So one of the things I want to end with is an example of what happened just the other day with my mother. I read, as I always have read, things to my mother. I read things to her because my mother's quite a character, and she does not like everything. She doesn't think that everything I do is golden. So some parents do. I happen not to have that kind of. My father did. My mother not so much. And so she would tell me, like when some stories say, that's okay. Maybe a page one story about something, maybe something political. But that was okay. That wasn't one of her best works. And but the stories of the flood, she said, that I liked. That was really good. She said that's going to win a Pulitzer. She said that's what she said. This is a woman from Rome, Georgia. Somehow she knew that. She was right. So she has very good. But anyway, I was reading part of a chapter to her, and it was interesting because what it came from was in 1922, after riots that occurred in Chicago, that were the result of the friction that was created in these cities with the arrival of masses of people from the South, combining with masses of people who were returning from Europe, all scuffling for the same kind of jobs, packed into an unforgiving city. there were riots. And there was segregation in Chicago. These riots occurred because there was a beach, the 28th Street beach. Anyone from Chicago? When I was actually covering Chicago, I wasn't aware, because I'd heard of it, but I hadn't really studied it. There was the 28th Street beach, which was on the south side, was segregated, meaning that there was a line where black people could not go south of 28th Street, and whites were to use the bathing and the water on the south of 28th Street. So that was the boundary line. And there was a young boy, he was a 16-year-old boy, who was swimming in the water, and he somehow drifted just past the line, out in the water, just past the line, the color line. Lake Michigan does not have a marker for that. It's just sort of, you know, up here somewhere. And people began pummeling him, pelleting him with rocks, and he drowned. And after that, they arrested many people, among them black and white, but primarily black people. And it was not clear all what happened. Black people were very angry that the white people they thought had done it were not arrested. Anyway, it's a riot, so it's obviously it's complex and difficult to decipher. But it set off one of the worst riots in the history of Chicago. And so as a result of that, there was a big study that was done, and the study asked people why they moved to the north. And so I was reading this to my mother, and she said, she kept talking, and I said, well, that means, one of them is, what do you like about the north? What difficulties do you think a person in the south meets in coming to the north? And so I kept trying to read the answers, and their answers were really sweet. Like, what do you like about the north? Freedom and opportunity to acquire something. Freedom allowed in every way. Freedom of speech, right to live and work as other races, higher pay for labor. Freedom, privileges, treatment of whites, ability to live in peace, not held down. Freedom of speech and action. Freedom was really a big thing. So she started talking, and I realized, you know, she's like, well, let me finish. And I realized, oh, you want to answer the questions. And so that's what the problem was. So she ended up being very cooperative to the end. So I wanted to, I thought I would actually end by reading a passage to you. If we have time. Do we have time? Okay. I want to introduce you to one of the characters.
And maybe what we'll do, Isabel, is if we have to talk between questions and reading, we'll listen to the reading, and then perhaps the conversation can carry on. We've got some people waiting.
Okay.
Sorry to be a policeman, but please, we'd love to hear the reading. This is great.
This is a person who went to Los Angeles from Louisiana. And I start, each introduction is in the present, well, at the time that I met her. This is Los Angeles, 1996. The heavy oak door soars a story high at the end of a walkway leading to a bleached Georgian well south of Wilshire. The door spreads open, and there stands a one-time bourbon-swilling Army captain and deft-handed surgeon, who now in his later years is a regular at the Vegas blackjack tables and the trifectas at Santa Anita, but who at the heart of it all, and perhaps most importantly, was a long-standing, still bitter, and somewhat obsessive expatriate from the 20th century South, the heartbreak Jim Crow land he had chosen to reject before it could reject him again. He's a Californian now, this Robert Pershing Joseph Foster. He is the color of strong coffee and has waves in his hair, which he lets grow as untamed as Einstein's, and then brushes back like the boys in the band. He's wearing a white Cotton Island shirt, loose slacks and sandals, the uniform of the well-to-do LA pensioner. He has the build and bearing of a Sammy Davis Jr., and not a little of the showmanship and delightful superficiality that seems to grow on people in certain circles of LA. He walks straight back and slew-footed into the foyer, past the curved, faux-gone-with-the-wind staircase and the East Asian pottery. He gestures toward the living room, an imposing museum of a space that dwarfs him in its volume, barely frozen in the seafoam draperies and tulip chairs out of a Sherby Doris Day movie from the 50s. The whole effect is as starched and formal as the tuxedos he used to wear in those LA parties he used to throw for himself back when Alice was alive and the money was rolling in like confetti. He seems accustomed to people fawning over the place, and with the prim air of leading men of his favorite movies from back in the 40s, insists on serving his guests a slice of lemon pound cake and vanilla ice cream on Rosenthal china, whether they would like to have it or not. His heavy-lidded eyes look straight into those of his listener and have a distractingly thick fringe of lashes like those seen only on babies and starlets. He is a physician, or was for most of his adult life, and by most accounts a very good one, and is prone to pontificate like a man of his years and accomplishments. But he is just as likely to interrupt himself and check the time to see if you can still make the 1 o'clock at the Hollywood racetrack. His photo albums are filled with the unlikely assortment of bookies and blues singers, dentists and fraternity men, and architects and society people whose approval he craved even though he knew they were too pretentious to matter really. He doesn't say it because it would be gauche in the first place and hardly worth mentioning from his point of view. But there happen to be a lot of little Roberts around town due to the fact that over the years he delivered a number of baby boys whose mothers were so grateful for his firm hand and ingratiating reassurances at the precise moment of truth that they named their sons not after their husbands, but after the doctor who delivered their babies. Before he begins the story, he tells you it's a long one and you can't get it all. He's lived too many lives, done too much, known too many people, ridden so high and so low there's no point in fooling yourself into thinking you can capture the whole of it. You could try, of course, and he agrees to give as much as he can. I love to talk, he says, a smile forming on his still chiseled face as he sits upright in his seafoam chair. And I am my favorite subject.